Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly compliance seminar here at CTR. I can't believe anybody is joining me this morning whenever it's so beautiful outside, but I'm glad to see we have a nice crowd here online, so that's wonderful. Most of you probably know me, but in case you don't, just to introduce myself, I'm Ann Lavelle. I'm the compliance specialist here at CTR. In my prior life, as many of you have heard me joke about, I was a partner at a large law firm that specialized in management side, in other words, employer side, labor and employment law. And I did that for almost a quarter of a century, came to my senses and retired. And I always enjoyed the educational component of things. So I enjoy doing these webinars. I'm very casual, as those of you who've heard me talk before know. Please feel free to ask questions. Now, I will preface this with, I'm not the most technical savvy person in the world. Whether the question works in the Q&A or the chat box, wherever, sometimes one seems to be turned off and I don't seem to know why. In any event, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. This will be a better learning experience for everybody, and more fun if you ask questions as we go along, and I will get to everybody's question. And I always stay late if we get a ton of questions like we did last time when we were covering the FLSA changes. So this topic today is sexual harassment. It's not a course on how to harass people. It is about preventing it. So today's format is essentially going to follow a very basic pattern. What is sexual harassment? A really brief refresher, just to make sure we're all on board and can recognize it. Even though it might seem very obvious to people, sometimes it's a little bit more insidious. We're going to talk about some best practices, and then we're going to dive into 5 or 6 cases that are real life cases that back when I practiced, I actually handled. And so we'll talk about them because I do have some insight into what all went on, what went wrong, what went right, who was stupid, who was not, and some things like that. So without more, we'll just dive in here. And again, please feel free to ask questions. So there's basically 2 types of sexual harassment. Everybody tends to think of sexual harassment as somebody pinching somebody else's butt or something like that. There's 2 different types that the law recognizes. The first is what we call quid pro quo. Probably a lot of you who've been around the block have heard this term before. It's you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Except we're not talking about backs here, right? And so if you do this sexual favor for me, or you go out with me, or whatever it is, then voila, you get promoted, or you get a raise, or something good happens to you at work. If you don't scratch my back, the opposite happens, right? Something bad. I don't keep my job, I get disciplined, whatever it might be. And then there's what we call hostile work environment, which is probably what most people think of. And that means that there's some conduct, some misconduct, really, that is either, and this isn't either or, this is really important to recognize when you're looking at one of these claims. The conduct has to be either severe or frequent, or both. It does not have to result in an adverse employment action. What does all that mean? So this conduct has to be unwanted. We are not talking about, hey, Bob asks Ann, I always pick on myself, out on a date, or Sarah asks Ann out on a date. That one-time thing, which happens in all workplaces, maybe it's wanted by me, maybe it's not. But assuming the other person has been polite and professional and doesn't do anything afterwards, regardless of my answer, yes or no, to make my life miserable, that's actually not harassment, right? That's neither severe nor pervasive. That is just sort of something that happens in life. Now, if they ask me out just one time and they start showing me videos of all their conquests in life, apparently they have an OnlyFans page or something, that might be severe enough, even though it's just one time, to constitute sexual harassment. Or if it's pervasive, I say no. No thanks, Bob. No thanks, Sarah. No thanks, whoever. I don't want to go out on a date. Appreciate it, but thank you. No, thank you. And then they ask me again the next day, and the next day, and the next day. That is a frequency that will certainly trigger a harassment claim. So, two main types of claims. And within the second type of claim, we should recognize that one instance, if it's bad enough, can be sexual harassment, or mild stuff that just happens over and over and over. And again, we're not talking about the consensual dating relationships here. Those can go south, those can become sexual harassment, but that's really not our focus this morning. One additional thing I want to point out that I have unfortunately run into more than I would hope to is you can have a situation where you do have a consensual relationship that affects somebody else. And so the perfect example of this is a supervisor who's dating a subordinate. It's consensual, no problem. Except another subordinate believes that he or she is getting the raw end of the deal because the supervisor's significant other gets all the posh jobs, all the plum assignments, whatever. You can run into a situation where you have a third party alleging some type of harassment as a result of a relationship between two other coworkers. Okay. Anyone can be a victim, right? There's no specific age for this. There's no specific gender. It can be male to female. That's the most common type, not surprisingly, perhaps just statistically, we know that. It can be female to male. It can be same sex. So anyone at any time can be a victim or a perpetrator. That used to not be the case. Some of you who have been around the block and are as old and decrepit as I am will recognize the same-sex sexual harassment didn't used to be recognized by the courts or by the federal government. It is now. So that is definitely on the table. It can be a supervisor to subordinate, right, to an employee. That's one of the worst types because your supervisors, and I harp on this all the time, are like the company speaking. If you have a supervisor doing this, it's much worse than a coworker doing this because the supervisor has power and authority over that person, or may be perceived to have power and authority over the victim. And the supervisor is held to a higher standard than a coworker. It's like they're speaking for the president of the company. You might as well have the president of the company down on the line hitting on people because the supervisor stands in the same type of shoes as the president of the company. It can be a subordinate to a supervisor. I had a case one time that involved a fast food restaurant, and the two managers were female, but most of the employees were young, stupid, perhaps teenage males. And there's young, stupid teenage females too out there for sure. But they decided to do some really nasty things to their female supervisors. It doesn't matter which direction this goes. It's harassment. A critical thing I think that sometimes is not realized here, you can get sexual harassment by a third party that you as the employer are responsible for handling. So if the guy in brown or the FedEx guy or whoever it might be, or gal, comes in and hits on people or shows them videos or calls them inappropriate names, you as the employer are responsible for remediating that problem if you know about it, and you should have reporting mechanisms to know about it. Even though that guy or gal from the third party is not your employee, that could be a very difficult thing to remediate because you don't have direct control over that third party who's being the bad actor or who's allegedly being the bad actor. And it usually takes reaching out to that employee's company and being like, hey, we've had a report that, Anne, She's the gal in brown. Every time she comes into her office, she just can't leave Jake, our receptionist, alone. And Jake is sick and tired of Ann asking him out. So that's an uncomfortable call, but you have to do it. All right. So what are the laws that we're looking at here? Title VII, right? Title VII covers a whole bunch of things. And there's something I want to make clear here, because we actually got this question after the FLSA seminar last month. These laws apply to both for-profit and nonprofit companies. There's some exceptions for religious-oriented institutions under Title VII. Religious institutions can, for instance, discriminate based on religion, because presumably if you're Catholic, you're only going to hire male priests, right? They don't really hire them, but so there's some exceptions, but for the most part, these laws, whether we're talking about the FLSA or Title VII or the ADA or the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act or any of the other alphabet soup that's out there, apply to both for-profit and non-profit entities, with some exceptions for religious nonprofit entities. So Title VII, are you covered by it? This covers sexual harassment. It covers a whole host of discrimination and harassment situations. You're covered by it if you have 15 or more employees. Now, some of you are probably sitting there saying, oh, great, I'm too tiny. It finally pays off to be small. I only have 10 employees. The problem with that is Pennsylvania, like most states, have laws that sweep in all of the smaller employees. So the PHRA, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, covers any employer with 4 or more employees. So you can be very tiny and still covered by these laws. And the PHRA, that act, essentially mirrors Title VII. So there's really no exception to say, well, hey, I'm a small employer, so I get a free pass and I can discriminate or harass. It's not how it works. There are local laws as well in many areas that take this down even to smaller employers. So be aware of that. With sexual harassment, the one thing that always seems to pop up or rears its ugly head are criminal laws, because sexual harassment often, unfortunately, involves touching, groping, brushing up against somebody, things like that. Whenever we have physical contact or the threat of physical contact, I look like I'm about to grab Ann's chest or something, we have assault and battery. We have threats sometimes, right? He won't stop asking me out. Is he stalking me, right? Do we have a stalking law involved? For companies, we have the concern of aiding and abetting, which is recognized in most jurisdictions. Aiding and abetting means you, bad employer, knew about this problem, whatever it is, did not stop it, and allowed it to continue to go on. You aided and abetted the perpetrator who was doing this. That's a criminal action that can get you into a lot of trouble as an employer. One of the things that we see and makes this really difficult, sexual harassment cases, as with any type of discrimination or harassment, really cause emotions to run high, right? Maybe the perpetrator cannot believe that they're being accused of this, and they're very upset and just, whatever. It makes it even worse when we have a situation where we have a civil action going, the sexual harassment claim, and concurrently, we have the supervisor or the coworker, whoever it is, who's the alleged perpetrator, criminal charges filed against them because they've allegedly touched, groped, whatever it might be, or appeared to threaten that in some way. That's very challenging to defend because of all the moving parts there. There's 3 basic forms of sexual harassment as well. So nonverbal, leering, staring, those looks, those eyebrows going. I know most of you are probably saying, please don't raise your eyebrows. And again, Anne, that was not attractive. I was never very good at this, I guess. Following, stalking, blowing kisses, blocking paths or doorways. Believe it or not, this comes up with some frequency. So I may have told this story before, but we had a case a long time ago at a large warehouse manufacturing facility with a supervisor. He's a first level supervisor. He was unfortunately going through a divorce, which probably was affecting his judgment in life. And they had a freight elevator, and his workstation was very close to the freight elevator. And so he decided, for reasons best known only to him, that he was going to charge a toll to get off the freight elevator. And that toll was one kiss to him for any female who wanted to get off the freight elevator. Unfortunately, that did not go over so well with some of his coworkers, and they reported him. Bad position for him. He had been with the company for a long time. They actually ended up eventually firing him because they gave him a warning and retraining for that. And he continued on his wayward ways. He just wasn't charging tolls anymore. He was doing other things. Jokes, right? That's probably the most common verbal thing. It's usually not people coming out right and saying like, some really dirty thing to somebody. That's usually a joke of some sort that is inappropriate for the workplace. The other one that comes up all the time is asking about a person's exploits, right? So, how many notches in the bedpost do you have? Not appropriate, obviously, but that particularly, it seems like among the younger crowd is, and I say that because I'm old, a common problem that occurs in the workplace. Videos. Not only don't you show your own videos if you have them, but obviously we shouldn't be showing videos of anything that's explicit in the workplace. Any form of unwanted touching. Now, some of this, it says hugging. Does that mean I can't ever hug a coworker? Or the verbal says, hey, you can't comment on a person's appearance. No, remember, this has to be unwanted. And if I say, wow, Anne, that's a really pretty dress today, that doesn't mean that I have just been sexually harassed, right? That's a one-off, really mild comment. Unless this happens all the time or starts to, be suggestive that the person's like, hey, wow, that's a nice dress. It's not harassment. We can give somebody a hug who's had a new baby or just got engaged or who's upset because they had a death in the family, whatever. We can do appropriate things like that. It's when it becomes unwanted and outside of what I would call social norms that we have a problem. I did anti-harassment training one time in the South, and the South has different terminology, right? And one of the supervisors and her crew came up to me afterwards, all upset. And I'm like, what's the issue? And she's like, I call everybody honey. And her crew was all like, yeah, it's fine with us. That's not unwanted. And if we keep in mind the location, deep South here, that did sexual innuendo in it, right? That had cultural innuendo in it, perhaps, that was just the way she referred to it. My take on that was, hey, it's fine as long as we don't have any of this other stuff. You're not touching your workers, you're not leering at them, you're not doing anything strange. And if somebody objects, then you don't use honey with them, right? And in the North, that might be a very different discussion because that's not a cultural thing that occurs most often. In any event. Okay, so some basics on prevention. That's sort of the 30,000 foot view of the law there and what we're looking at. Please have a handbook that prohibits this. That is Exhibit 1, when, not if, you get sued for any type of harassment or discrimination or whatever. Okay, we had a question come in that I love and is anticipating one of my future slides. So I'm going to tell everybody what the question is, and then I'm going to postpone answering it for a second, because this is a great question to think about. So it says, do these actions need to have occurred at work and or during working hours to be considered sexual harassment? What happens, what if it happens only outside of work? For example, inappropriate text messages after work hours. So I will give a little bit of an answer here, but we'll go into this in more depth. You are responsible. That's a tough burden for an employer, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Great question, and a very common scenario where two employees or more are doing something stupid outside of work, or posting something stupid, or texting or calling or whatever. But I'll finish answering that question in a minute. Great question. Have at least two reporting options. Why is this? I've had the HR director be the perpetrator before. The EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, basically mandates this, even if you're small, and that can be difficult sometimes if you're small. Who we're going to have as a second report, right? Especially if we have a small family-owned company, that may be really challenging. But we're supposed to have two avenues of reporting, two different people. And again, on at least two occasions, I've had the HR director or manager, whatever their title might have been, be responsible as the perpetrator. In fact, in one case, the HR manager apparently did not, in fact, he was the VP of HR, did not have enough to do with his time. The company found out, this was a large company, found out by sort of just sheer dumb luck that he was spending over 40 hours a week watching porn videos in his office, sometimes with his assistant. In any event, so you need multiple avenues. In that case, it was the tech group who discovered this through some routine computer maintenance or monitoring, whatever it was they were doing. And luckily, that company had two methodologies of reporting. One was to the VP of HR. Another was to the president of the company. This company had about 100 employees. And that report went to the company, to the president, who actually called us because, you know, his expertise was not HR. He was alarmed at this, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. And we actually stepped in and did the investigation. What normally the VP of HR would do. It was pretty clear cut, even though the VP of HR said he would sue them for sex discrimination because he was male. In any event, he never did sue. But you do want two reporting mechanisms. Climate surveys. We'll talk about that more in a second, and that actually goes to some of the what if it happens after hours type of idea. You're sort of taking the pulse of your company, not just on sexual harassment, but on everything, right? Is there an issue here? You always want to know if there's an issue in the workplace so that you can address it rather than it going outside of your company to the EEOC or the PHRC, which is the Pennsylvania Commission that addresses these things, or whatever state you're in. You want to be able to nip this in the bud. You want to know if there's a problem. I've had a number of companies in my lifetime say, oh, I don't want to do harassment training, which is a little different than climate surveys. Harassment training, you should be doing at least once a year, along with discrimination training. Really anti-harassment, anti-discrimination training. We're not training people how to do this. You want to do that at least once a year. And these climate surveys, we probably should be doing every year as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you get an anonymous report, well, first, let me back up one second. I lost my train of thought there for a moment. I'm getting old. You want to know. So I had a lot of companies that would say, oh, I don't want to bring in harassment training. I don't want to show a video. I mean, you don't have to have someone like me come in and do this, although I do recommend you have a live presenter if you think you have issues in the workplace. Because a live presenter sometimes can ferret out those issues and see what people's reactions are to things, and you can kind of look at what's happening. You can do this via video. There's things you can buy online for like 25 bucks, whatever. Do something. I've had companies that say, oh, I don't want to do the training because what if it gives my employees ideas? I don't want them to have ideas. The reality is they already have ideas. What you want is A, to fulfill your legal obligation to provide the training, which is required. And number two, you want to ferret out a problem if you've got one going. Somebody just asked a question here that I should have said at the beginning. And I thank you for the reminder here. Somebody asked if we will send the slides after this. Yes, we do. So I should have done this as part of the housekeeping, but again, apparently I have cobwebs in my brain today. We always send out a copy of all the slides to everybody who has signed up for this. We also make the recording, if you have insomnia and want to hear this again, available as well to everybody. It takes us a little bit of time to do that. So it's not instantaneous after this, but it's usually up by the next day. And it will go out in an email as well, so that you have all the information here. It's a good question. I'm sorry I didn't think about that beforehand. All right, let me just continue here a second. I see we have a couple more questions coming in, but let me finish the slide here first. So EPLI, I sound like a broken record on this as well. Employment practices, liability insurance. This will not cover the criminal acts, but it will cover the civil lawsuit or the civil charge of discrimination. You want that insurance no matter what your size is, because you don't want these cases to be a bet the farm type of case. And attorneys are really expensive, right or wrong. You want this so that when you make an employment decision, you're betting a headache, because it will be a headache, and your deductible. And you can quantify this for the bean counters in your company then. When you're looking at a high-risk termination, you're saying, well, what's our downside? And, we're concerned because we know Sarah has been asking Ann out every single day and we did nothing about it. But Ann's a really lousy employee and we want her gone anyway. We can quantify that risk to the bean counters that we report to say, well, we have EPLI. It won't cover the criminal actions of Sarah, who's, been hitting on Ann and groping her or whatever, but it will cover the civil action against the company. Make sure you get good EPLI. These are difficult to defend cases because oftentimes, and going to the one person who asked about after hours things, it's he said, she said, right? It's me saying, hey, every single day, Sarah has asked me out, or Bob has asked me out, or whoever. I'm just hoping somebody asks me out. No, I'm happily married. But that's the type of thing. It's he said, she said, very difficult to defend. So somebody asked about off-duty conduct. Absolutely. If we know about it, right? If somebody comes to us and says, hey, Ann and Bob, are both employees. It doesn't even have to be Ann and Bob coming to you or one of them and says, Ann's getting these text messages from Bob with graphic pictures of his private parts. And she's really upset and cries and tries to avoid him in the workplace. That's now on your shoulders to investigate, to look into, and to resolve. And again, that can be tough, but you call in any good investigation, you call in the victim, right? You talk to them. Ideally, you might have two witnesses there. Everything that's said is as confidential as you can make it. This isn't broadcast to the entire company. You call in Bob to get his side of the story. You call in any of the witnesses and you talk to them, right? And any investigative notes that you take are kept separate and apart from the personnel file because that's required by the law. And you look into it. Any witnesses, right? If Ann says, well, hey, Julie has seen him doing blah, 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 you call in Julie. And at the end of the day, you may have to make a credibility determination as to how frequent or severe or whether this conduct even existed. Maybe Ann's got an axe to grind against Bob and Ann made this whole thing up. It's possible. But you're in a difficult position. At a minimum, you have to investigate. Okay, somebody asked what are climate surveys. I will get to that in a minute. Let me get this other question here. Our organization terminated an individual for sexual harassment. We went to an unemployment hearing and lost because we did not bring the victim to the unemployment hearing. How should we handle this? They stated the emails from the victim were hearsay. So that's all true. It is hearsay because the actual person was not there to authenticate or verify the email that they may have written, although if they were written by the perpetrator, presumably he or she was at the unemployment hearing and could have been asked about it. In my view, in life on things, I never really care about unemployment. That's the least of my concerns in all of this. Unemployment has different legal standards, different evidentiary standards, different just about everything standards than the court cases that involve or the charges that involve any type of harassment or discrimination. So whatever the findings may have been in unemployment is not going to rock my world with respect to a civil action on sexual harassment. If you're still within the appeal period, you might be able to appeal, but I'm not sure you're going to go anywhere with the unemployment claim since the actual witness, the actual victim was not there. And it's tough to overturn a UC referee's decision. Again, I know nobody likes to have that unemployment claim on their books, so to speak. But of everything that's out here in this world of sexual harassment, that's the least of my concerns is what happens at the unemployment, because that's the least dollar amount of anything we're talking about. Okay. Moving on here, assuming I can get my computer to work. 1 second. I lost my little cursor. Here it is. Okay. All right, some interesting statistics, and I do want to dive into our cases here, but so we'll breeze through some of these statistics. The EEOC gets between 6,000 to 8,000 of these types of complaints every year. 80% are from women. About a quarter of the complaints also allege other types of discrimination, usually race or ethnicity, and almost half allege retaliation. Often the retaliation claim is more difficult to defend than the sexual harassment claim because these claims are highly emotional by both the perpetrator and the victim. Oftentimes the perpetrator can't figure out why they have been tagged for this, and sometimes rightly so. Maybe they really haven't done anything, and sometimes it's because they did do something. Emotions are running high, and so now they're no longer inviting Anne, who complained about harassment, to the company meetings or whatever it is. That's retaliation, right? You don't actually have to terminate me to have retaliation, although certainly if you do, that's definitely retaliation. So emotions run high. All right, you can see the common issues in the complaints here. Almost half involve discharge. Others involve harassment that's non-sexual. So you have sexual harassment plus harassment based on some other protected category. I'm gay, I'm over 40, hard to believe. Whatever it might be is the additional claim there. Terms and conditions of employment, right? You moved me from my posh office to a cubicle. Constructive discharge, which means, hey, it was such a hostile work environment, I had no choice but to quit. You didn't actually fire me, but because Bob's conduct to me was so severe, I had no choice but to exit. And I'm justified in doing that, or some type of discipline. You can see the states in green that have the most complaints. Pennsylvania is not one of them. One thing I wanted to point out on one of the prior slides is although the EEOC only gets 6,000 to 8,000 claims a year, we have state and local agencies that get just as many, if not more. And so that's just a small drop in the bucket of what we see out there. And the EEOC, for the most recent data that we've got, recovered close to 300 million on these types of claims alone. Again, this does not include private lawsuits. It doesn't include state or local actions. And it doesn't include attorney's fees. These laws are what we call fee shifting provisions. In other words, if I, the employer, lose the case, I not only pay my own attorney for having lost my case, but I pay the employee's attorney as well. It's a fee shifting statute, which is true of most federal laws. All right, we asked about climate surveys and stuff and after hours work stuff. So we have here the exact language from the EEOC talking about after hours work. We've always known that harassment via the employer's computer systems is prohibited. We should have at least some minimal checking or monitoring of that, especially if we're a larger company. But the EEOC, and this is very recent guidance that sort of solidifies some of the case law that's been out there for a while, says, hey, any virtual conduct that occurs in a non-work related context. And by the way, when we talk non-work related, we're not talking the holiday party. That's work related. We're not talking the softball game that's sponsored by the company. That's all considered work related. So certainly if we're at the Christmas party or the softball game and we've got a problem going there, that is work related harassment, even though it's not on our premises, so to speak, for Christmas parties at a hotel or something. We're responsible for that. Non-work related, we're talking about, hey, Ann on her own decides to go to the watering hole with Sarah and Bob and Jake and whoever. It's not a company sponsored event. And she gets drunk and starts hitting on Jake and won't get off him. And is just a real pain. And after that, she decides to send him 1 million texts a day, telling him how much she loves him and hopes they're going to have a great future together. If you know about that, if Jake comes to you and says, hey, this happened, or you hear about it somehow, right? We have to have knowledge. We're not responsible for monitoring Ann's Facebook page. But if Jake comes or Sarah comes and says, you won't believe what happened, they went out and now Ann won't leave Jake alone, you have knowledge, you're responsible for investigating, you're responsible for looking into it. You can only investigate to the extent that people cooperate with you, right? So if Jake won't talk to you or won't share the text messages that Ann has sent him, your hands are a little tied, but you make the decisions that you need to make based on the information that you have. Same thing with anonymous reports. The climate surveys that we're talking about are relatively new as well. So the EEOC came out a couple months ago and said, hey, employers should conduct, so maybe not mandated, but strongly recommended by the EEOC. And I take anything that the EEOC says as a good idea because I want to be able to defend a case if I get it. I want to show that I followed their advice and says, hey, should conduct a climate survey. It can be electronic, it can be on paper, it could be in person, doesn't matter, to see if there's any issues in the workplace, harassment, discrimination, whatever. That doesn't mean that you need to say, hey, on my survey, have you been harassed? If so, check the box for the employee who did it to you. No, it means I'm going to ask some general questions, right? I don't have to say, how do you feel about sexual harassment in the workplace, or how do you feel about race discrimination? I can say, do you feel welcome? Do you feel included? How do you like the work environment? We make these questions open-ended. And again, we actually hope that if there's an issue, we're going to hear about it. You are so much better off. Even if you have to pay some attorney's fees to give you some advice as you work through the investigation, so much better off to address it internally, both from an ethics standpoint as well as from a financial standpoint, to be able to say, we found out about it, we addressed it, we did prompt remedial action if necessary, and we all moved on, hopefully. So that's a climate survey. The EEOC is saying once a year, you should poll your employees essentially about how they feel about your workplace to try to ferret out harassment and discrimination. They also recommend that you conduct bystander training. Now, to me, that's an easy peasy thing to do. Essentially, you're encouraging bystanders to report issues. So Anne may be the one being harassed, but Susie sees it. Susie's the bystander. Susie can report it. It doesn't matter that Anne didn't report it, right? The victim does not have to be the reporting person. It's enough that somebody in the organization reported it. And if Susie reported it, then we're going to look into it. And by the way, whether it's Anne reporting or Susie reporting, you cannot retaliate against Susie, even if she misunderstood the whole situation. As long as she's acting in good faith, we cannot retaliate her and say against her for making that report. All right, let's move on to our cases here and talk about this. So these are all cases that I had the fortune or misfortune, I'm really not sure which, to handle when I practice law. So give me 1 second to take a drink here. Rips and cock guns. So some of you might be saying, I can see where this is going. We had an all-male crew on a natural gas rig in central Pennsylvania. Now, as you sit here, what image comes to your mind of an all-male crew working hard, living in trailers in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania? These guys are paid extremely well. They work 12-hour shifts, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Lots of overtime, because remember, these guys would never, ever, ever be eligible under the FLSA for any exemption because they're doing manual work. They're not supervising anybody. There's no advanced knowledge, no discretion in judgment. They're basically doing heavy manual work, getting paid buku bucks plus overtime for this. But you might envision a workplace that's a little uncouth, perhaps. It's not the same as an office environment. And might not be as neat as an office environment either. We have Joe, I've changed his name, from South Dakota. Because the pay is so good, he drives 20 hours every 2 weeks to central Pennsylvania to do his 2 weeks on, his 2-week hop, his 2-week off. Joe likes the local watering hole. This is Joe's first problem here. He likes it a little too much. There is a watering hole, which allegedly also had prostitutes, but that wasn't our issue. He likes visiting there. At the start of every shift, this company has a mandatory safety meeting because what they're doing is really somewhat dangerous. Every employee is required to be at the mandatory safety meeting every morning. Bob's the supervisor. Joe doesn't show up one day. Not a great thing for Joe because he's hungover. Bob, the supervisor, sends a coworker to the living quarters to retrieve Joe for the safety meeting. And Bob is thoroughly ticked off about this situation. And Joe shows up not only late, but now he's wearing a ripped overall. The supervisor is thoroughly irritated at this point because the work overalls or uniform is actually a flame retardant specialized uniform that the company provides. If you have a hole in flame retardant overalls, they're not flame retardant anymore, right? Common sense, one would think. The supervisor, who's thoroughly ticked off at this point, reaches over, takes hold of the existing rip and rips it further, telling Joe exactly what kind of idiot he is. I can't tell you how much I cleaned that up for this discussion here today. Joe's hungover, he's late, he's in inappropriate safety gear. The rip, by the way, was on the back of Joe's thigh. And if you can believe Joe, part of his undies showed when this happened. In any event, that was a source of debate in this case. But Bob says, go get a new uniform, change, and get on your duty shift. So Joe goes and gets a new uniform. Do we have any problems here? And by the way, you can chime in on the Q&A or wherever. I would say no. Joe's in a lot of trouble. He gets written up for this. Do we have sexual harassment here? Anybody want to chime in? All right. It continues because we can't just be satisfied with one thing. We have more issues here. And this is often Murphy's Law, right? We get one issue and it just continues to spiral. Later that week, Joe is instructed to go to the supply trailer to obtain more caulk. And by the way, these guys live in these like portable trailers. And I am told that they clean these trailers up for when legal counsel comes to visit. And if they actually clean this up for me, I'm still horrified. But in any event, we'll move on. Joe can't find the caulk. So he goes to the supervisor's trailer, and Bob's there with one of Joe's coworkers. And keep in mind, this is an all-male crew, kind of rough around the edges, right? We don't have guys with PhDs sitting around here. And he asks for more caulk because his caulk gun is empty. Bob and the coworker use their best sophomoric humor, right, to turn this into a joke about the need for a caulk, size, whether he needs a newer, better one, and some tips on how to use the caulk gun. So obviously we have innuendo here, right? Lots of stupid humor. Bob and the coworker both say, hey, Joe reciprocated this humor. He thought it was funny. He laughed. Joe later says, hey, I was mortified. And I have experienced severe emotional trauma as a result of the caulk gun jokes. On Joe's next 2-week stint, he calls off because his car broke down. That's what he tells them. He gets written up for that because it was a last-minute call off. They had trouble replacing him, blah, blah, blah. For the next 2-week stint, so this is like a month later, he no calls, no shows, and he's fired. That would have been his third disciplinary action. It's pursuant to their handbook. He's gone. He's upset. He's lost his good paying job. He sues for sexual harassment and says, hey, it wasn't his car, but the hostile work environment that caused him to miss work. Does he have a claim? Anybody want to chime in? Why take a drink? So Joe thinks he has a claim. Joe files with the Pennsylvania Commission, which handles these. He could have filed with the EEOC. He just happened to choose the PHRC. The PHRC was not very sympathetic to him. And ultimately, we got this dismissed. PHRC said, and there's good case law to back this up, is, hey, first of all, you have to look at the work environment. We're not going to have the same expectations of a gas rig staffed in the middle of nowhere with some folks who might be a little rough around the edges than we do, say, a law firm or a doctor's office or a professional organization where you would say, gosh, they should be a little bit more refined, perhaps. They also said, hey, we don't really see the sexual intent here, right? We see some stupidity, perhaps, but not the sexual intent. And so we did get this case dismissed, but the one thing I want to point out, even if you win, you can lose, right? This company had employment practices liability insurance. But until this case got dismissed, they probably had, and we got it dismissed relatively early, probably about $30,000 in attorney's fees into this. And the witnesses, one of them had been relocated to Colorado. So we had issues just within the company of getting the right people into Pennsylvania to testify, to do whatever, with respect to this. So this was pre-COVID when live attendance was still important, but you can win and still have a total headache with respect to something like this, because this company has paid out its deductible. It has paid out expenses to do this, and it has a headache basically because of this. All right, next one. So I want to point out this case was before same-sex sexual harassment was recognized at the federal level. It was recognized by some states at this point, but not the EEOC or the federal government. We have a large mining company, again, difficult workplace, right? In the sense that's a little rougher around the edges. This company too was self-funded for workers' comp. That becomes important. We had 3 male workers driving through on a little, almost like a little Jeep thing, if you've ever been in a coal mine. They're driving through. One of the subordinates, Carl, who's involved in this, was a former Vietnam vet who, without doubt, suffered from PTSD from the war. He had lots of mental health issues. The supervisor was very unhappy with Carl because he perceived Carl to be engaging in a huge safety violation in the mine, because Carl not only did not have a working headlamp, he didn't have like a backup battery that he was supposed to be carrying. And he just, I mean, that can actually be very dangerous to the mine. The mine couldn't be dark. You could lose power in there. It was not a good idea by Carl not to have the safety equipment. So the supervisor's unhappy. Supervisor decides to express his unhappiness, though, by telling Carl that he's going to bend him over the rail, and I'll let you read this yourself, but essentially make him bleed through anal sex. Carl got up. Carl was very upset. The co-worker who was driving the vehicle drove a little further, stopped the vehicle, and said to the supervisor, and I'll clean this up a whole bunch, "What the heck was that about? Are you into that? And if so, I didn't think that was cool at all. I think you're," insert your favorite expletive, for saying that. Carl says that this encounter re-triggered his PTSD, because he believes, and whether this is true or not is not as relevant as to what he believes for his mental state, that in Vietnam there was rampant homosexuality and venereal disease, and now he can no longer work. He files, interestingly enough, a workers' comp claim, because remember, at this time, same-sex sexual harassment did not occur, or wasn't recognized. Not that it didn't occur. Does he win? Anybody want to guess on this? Play along with me. Make me feel like the audience is still awake here. Yes or no? Does he win his workers' comp claim? In workers' comp, okay, we got a couple people chiming in. Okay, interesting. Let me just take a look here. Okay, some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. In workers' comp land, you can have a psychological injury, but you have to prove you had abnormal working conditions. This case went clear to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and he won. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, hey, even though we don't recognize at this time same-sex sexual harassment, that comment was so ugly and so severe, and I actually cleaned it up a little bit here. All I do is clean up things, because if I put the actual stuff, I'd probably get flagged all over the place. They said, hey, that's so severe. That's abnormal working conditions, which is the equivalent of a hostile work environment. It's just the parlance that workers' comp uses. Then we're going to award benefits. He had a huge award at that point. We lost. In any event, and maybe rightly so, because that was an ugly, ugly case from a whole bunch of perspectives. I want to point out, though, that even after the federal system and the courts recognized that same-sex sexual harassment was actionable, okay, and that's been true for at least 15 years or so, we still sometimes get workers' comp cases like this. So the most recent one I have before I stopped practicing was this was in Johnstown, so relatively small community compared to Pittsburgh or something. And we had a husband and wife both working at a large manufacturing type of facility. The wife worked as a secretary in the business office, and the husband was out on the floor doing hard work. Nobody is completely sure why, but somebody decided to pick on the wife, and we never did figure out who. But it culminated, and I will say the company was trying very hard to figure this out. It culminated in somebody ejaculating into a sock and leaving it smudged all over her workstation. She quit. She filed both a sexual harassment claim as well as a workers' comp psychological injury claim. And we ended up settling both in one package, but you can still get today workers' comp claims that accompany sexual harassment claims if you have abnormal working conditions, which is the equivalent of a hostile work environment. So don't lose sight of that. That's a possibility. All right. Moving on, because I want to get us respectful here of everybody's time. We're running out of time, so I'm going to breeze through some of these, and then I'm happy to stay for questions. This one I've talked about before, but it's a great case and a great reminder of what can be out there. This company allowed rap music by some famous folks to be played in their workplace. They had 8 women complain and said, hey, this is denigrating, this music is denigrating to women. Shouldn't play it. It's awful, really inappropriate lyrics, etc. And the workplace said, no, we can play this music. It's motivational. Now, to a certain extent, I get what they're saying because it's got rhythm, it's got beat, whatever. Maybe it keeps me going while I'm doing mundane tasks in the workplace. But the court ultimately said, hey, no, that's not appropriate. This same logic applies to calendars in the workplace, posters, pottery. There's a famous sexual harassment case out there. It was one of the first that involved one of the big 3 automakers in Detroit, where apparently the auto workers did pottery in their free time and had interesting displays of their art on the lunchroom tables that represented human anatomy. And the court said, hey, that's not appropriate either. That rises to the level of a hostile work environment if, in that case, it was women who had to go into the lunchroom and look at male anatomy that had been carefully crafted by some of their coworkers. So keep in mind that what's decorating your workplace or playing in your workplace can also be a subject of sexual harassment in a hostile work environment. This is an interesting one because, and some of you may be saying, hey, Ann, you need to get a life if you think all this is interesting. This is a situation, young female employee, first job out of college type of thing. She believes she's being harassed by the bank president. She complains to the chairman. She's immediately fired. Now, that in and of itself is probably a great retaliation claim because they fired her like within a day or two of making the complaint. But what's even more interesting is that the father of this young lady is an attorney who handled all the foreclosure matters for the bank. When she's fired, he calls up the bank and says, hey, you're going to get an EEOC complaint. The bank then pulls all of the legal work that they had been sending to this father for foreclosure actions. And then he ultimately defaults on his own mortgage because all of his work has been pulled. Who has a claim? Well, just about everybody. Obviously, the young lady has a claim, but the father has a third-party retaliation claim because arguably they pulled the work because of his advocating for his daughter that she had been harassed and retaliated against. So when we look at retaliation claims, it's not just the victim who can have the retaliation claim. It can be coworkers, it can be third parties, it can be folks that we do business with, whoever it might be, can have a claim. All right, questionable visitor. And again, I'm racing through some of these just so we can be respectful of everybody's time. This involved an independent salesman coming in, and apparently, I don't know why he thought this was all a good idea, but he did everything from making sexual remarks to passing gas on this lady's phone. Gosh, who doesn't want to date him? I can't figure this one out. Ultimately, this went on for 3 years, and this customer service representative, who was an employee of the company, complained to the company. Her supervisor just was kind of like, he's an a-hole, basically. You just got to live with him. When that didn't get her any satisfaction, by the way, that was a huge mistake by the supervisor not to run this up the flagpole. You see that with first level supervisors. They need to be trained better so they know to run things up the flagpole to HR. This lady went to HR. HR banned the guy. That might have been resolved this whole thing, except then they backtracked. Probably because somebody higher up said, oh, we can't ban him. He's a great sales guy. And said, okay, you can still come into our workplace, but you can't interact with this one customer service rep. We don't want that happening. She's upset. She takes a medical leave and eventually resigns. Yes, That's a hostile work environment, the court said, because they didn't fix the problem. Remember, the fix is prompt, effective, remedial action. Certainly wasn't prompt because the supervisor dropped the ball, and it didn't look very good that initially they say, hey, we're banning, then when they backtracked because of pressure from the higher ups. Okay, almost Chris Hemsworth. Who doesn't like Chris Hemsworth? Yeah, I probably just harassed Chris Hemsworth. We won't tell him. 29-year-old marketing executive. Apparently, he was pretty hot. And his coworkers, who are all female, joked about the fact that he could close any sale, and that all he had to do was essentially play nice, and all the female clients would sign on the dotted line. He never actually had to perform any sex acts to get anybody to sign anything, but he didn't like this. It made him feel uncomfortable and denigrated. Does he have a claim? Yeah, he does, right? It doesn't matter which way this harassment goes. It doesn't matter that he didn't have to actually grope or grab anybody. What matters is what was said to him. So he has a claim. This was kind of an ugly case in West Virginia. Longtime salesman, worked with 3 different secretaries. Whenever you have more than one female plaintiff or more than one plaintiff in general, it's a real concern because that's the rare exception and not the norm. These 3 women brought a claim saying, hey, every time they were sitting at the secretary's desk, he made it a point to reach into the file cabinet, which he refused to move, and grope them, basically. And all 3 women sued. This company had EPLI. Remember that even if you have EPLI, if you have a lot of claims or a very expensive claim, as this one turned out to be, your rates go up, you can get canceled. So while you want EPLI, you don't want to take advantage of it either. The outcome, these women, the EPLI carrier hated this case so much for a whole bunch of reasons involving groping and the threat of criminal actions and aiding and abetting and all sorts of stuff. They settled this for almost $450,000, so a little over $100,000 to each of the women involved. That is it. I hope we have ended on time here. I appreciate everybody's attention and input during this. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to be back next month, same time, same bat channel. And we're going to be talking about disparate treatment versus sort of direct discrimination. We were supposed to talk about that last time, but we ran out of time after our really robust FLSA discussion, which was great that we had that, but we've sort of saved that for next time. Oh, people who are saying thank you, you are most welcome. I really enjoy doing these. Again, some of you may be saying she needs to get a life, that she thinks this is enjoyable, but I really do enjoy doing this. We're also, I sound even better if you've had a drink. We're doing cocktails and compliance August 8th. It's going to be at Walnut Grill in Wexford, right off of 19. They have great food, great drinks. And we're going to talk about the various leave laws out there and how that works. And again, everybody is welcome. I'm so glad you enjoyed this. And please, I'll hang on one more second here in case we have any more questions. But again, all this will be made available, the audio, the video, whatever we want to call this, as well as the slides. Just give us about a day to get this all sent out to everyone. And I hope everybody goes out there and enjoys this beautiful weather. Okay, take care, everyone.